So thanks so much. Great. Okay, well, so welcome, folks. I know folks will trickle in as the hour goes on. We really appreciate you being here for our patient advocacy coffee chat this week. This week, we are going to talk about some really interesting international issues, challenging international issues, but of course, ones that we hope we have some solutions for. And our guests today are Phyllis Arthur, who's our Vice President for Emerging Science Policy, and Fumie Griego from the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, IFPMA. Before I get into that, just a couple of quick updates for folks. Remember, our Bio-Digital Convention is coming up June 10th to the 18th. It's really long this year. The first week is mostly the scientific partnering and deal making. And June 14th to 17th is the educational programming. Everybody who is with a nonprofit does get a comp. So please contact Ashley if you would like, if you haven't received one and you'd like us to get you one. And again, the goal there is really to just connect you with the biotech community. On the June 11th at 1 p.m., there's a virtual networking event for the patient advocacy community. So again, Ashley will make sure you have all those links. And we are still accepting some submissions for the Patient Health and Advocacy Summit coming up at the end of October. So if you have ideas for panels, topics, or anything in particular that you would like us to explore at the summit, or if you have an idea for a panel and you would like to contribute in that way, we would very much appreciate your ideas. We did send a link with a call for submissions, but you can always send ideas to Ashley as well. I also want to make sure that all of you meet our newest team member, Sarah Funkhauser, who is on the line. And Sarah is who I didn't tell I would be calling out her out. Hello, Sarah. So Sarah is our operations manager for the external affairs team and my right-hand person. So I am very, very happy that she's here because she will make sure I'm organized. Okay, excellent. So our goal today really is to talk to you all about some actionable and really agreed upon opportunities that the biopharmaceutical sector has come together really on to address global vaccine equity, which is a huge challenge and a huge issue, of course, as folks know. And specifically, we're talking about COVID. But as we know that things in the US have turned the corner so much for many of our areas, geographic areas, if you're in an area where vaccines have become available, but we know that that's not the case around the world. So as usual, I'm just going to moderate this like it's a conversation. I told Fumie and Phyllis it's my Oprah moment. So that's what makes it fun. Again, so Phyllis, our VP for Infectious Disease Emerging Science Policy, and Dr. Griego, who's the Deputy Director General and the COO of IFPMA. So we'll go ahead and get started. So Phyllis, on May 19th, the public announcement was made. IFPMA, Bio, and other organizations announced 5 steps to urgently advance COVID-19 vaccine equity. Can you give us a high-level overview of this, the roadmap, and sort of the problem it's looking to solve?
Absolutely, Michelle. Can you hear me okay? So
Hello,
everyone. A little faint. These are always so fun. How's that? Okay. So hello everyone. Good morning. It's really great to see all of you. So the 5 steps to equity and access for global was actually a document we worked on in partnership with a bunch of different trade associations representing the biopharmaceutical industry. What we wanted to do was share the commitments of industry and how industry and governments and multilateral organizations and NGOs work together to get more vaccines into particularly low and middle income countries in this year, in 2021. And it was a chance for us to actually share some concrete solutions, some of which are underway, to increase production and manufacturing of vaccines worldwide, to stress the partnerships that industry has already done to make sure that the products that were developed, the vaccines that were developed by industry in partnership with some governments or independently could actually be scaled up and scaled out. That is, manufactured around the world, either making the vaccine itself or filling and finishing it, putting it into vials, boxes, and getting it, particularly through the global instrument that was stood up to get doses to the world. That's COVAX. And we wanted to really encourage governments to do those near-term immediate things that they could do in partnership with industry to move doses around, reducing the export controls that are keeping the free flow of both supplies for manufacturing as well as finished doses. Starting to think about and concretely do dose donations from countries that have excess doses already because they vaccinated a big chunk of their population into COVAX, and specifically focusing on those some low middle income countries. And more than anything, helping industry to manufacture to the maximum amount that they can with the existing facilities they can. It's important to note that there are over 300 voluntary partnerships between the companies that have developed vaccines and various manufacturing sites, be they contract sites, be they developing country vaccine manufacturers, or European partners, or actually large company partners. So unprecedented to see Novartis making vaccine for one company, and Sanofi making vaccine for Pfizer, and Merck making vaccines for J&J. So we are leveraging worldwide some of the finest state-of-the-art production facilities around the world and the best partners with really rapid tech transfer. Because the roadmap is really about laying out the best way governments can work quickly to help that process and get those doses delivered. And after the roadmap happened, a couple of days later, both governments and companies announced very large either supplies or donations to COVAX, specifically targeted for low middle income countries. It's about reinforcing everyone's commitment to get the world vaccinated as soon as we possibly can. And I think that's one of the things that's most important about the roadmap. It reinforces that goal. What's going to make it faster to get more people vaccinated worldwide?
Thank you. So Fumie, one of the challenges, again, as Phyllis mentioned, you were trying to get the world vaccinated ASAP. We've also heard a lot about the TRIPS waiver. Could you talk a little bit high level at what the TRIPS waiver is and what problem it is trying to solve?
Sure, Michelle, thank you again for inviting me to your coffee chat. I think to really echo what Phyllis said, a lot of what's happening really gets to this issue, really serious issue of vaccine equity across the world. We have countries who have progressed incredibly well, so congratulations to the US, and I live in Switzerland and we're doing a pretty good job here as well. That said, there are countries who are falling behind for a number of reasons. I think, unfortunately, even though the industry really leaned into the establishment of the COVAX facility, as Phyllis mentioned, for a number of reasons, including the fact that they relied heavily on doses produced in India to distribute to the low-income countries. But given the current situation in India, that pipeline of doses that we were expecting to be distributed to the lowest income countries are not leaving India, because India, of course, needs to take care of its own population, and there's a lot of restrictions in terms of export of products from India. So that has created a bit of a crisis situation, and everyone is looking for solutions to sort of lock the doses to go where they need to go. And so I think there is this need that the discussions around the TRIPS waiver is trying to address. And for those of you who don't know all of the Geneva acronyms, and I personally had to learn a whole new set when I moved to Geneva 4 years ago, TRIPS is the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. And that is an agreement that the World Trade Organization established many years ago to create a bit of standardization on how intellectual property is respected across countries. So it's an important tool to facilitate trade, but also to establish and maintain incentives for innovation. And of course, intellectual property is an important ingredient in creating the incentives for our industry to continue to invest in risky ventures. And so from that perspective, it's a really important international instrument to reinforce incentives for innovation. What the waiver is proposing to do is to, during the time of the pandemic, waive certain rights with respect to patents and IP. And the idea here, I think, is what sounds simple is, well, if everyone could copy the vaccines, there would be more of them to be distributed around the world. I'm kind of oversimplifying, but I think that's kind of the rationale. We've seen this kind of arguments in other access to medicines discussions over the years, but particularly for vaccines, even more so than for some of the other, medicines that are chemically based, it's really difficult to produce, even if you have the recipe. So the know-how, the technology, the people power that you need in order to create, high quality vaccines, it's not something you can easily copy paste. So although I think there is, no stone unturned in terms of trying to ramp up production, I think what's unfortunate is that if we do something like the TRIPS waiver, we actually disincentivize the kind of partnerships that Phyllis talked about. It really relies on a lot of know-how transfer that requires good established relationships. And those relationships are key in order to make the ramp up of production as successful as can be. And what we worry is that something like the TRIPS waiver doesn't actually address the core issue of what it takes to increase production, and may even take away from the progress that current manufacturers are making in order to focus on delivering the doses that they have committed to. And so if you look at some of the information we provided with the 5 steps, there's a company called Airfinity that does a lot of modeling. They're an independent source of information, and what they've been able to show is the really incredible scale up of production that's happened with the partners that exist now. That we are on target to reach potentially 11 billion doses by the end of the year. This is where it, this is their forecast of what will happen, not just what companies say they are going to do, because as you've seen in the headlines, this is a very tricky process, and even the most experienced companies have had trouble meeting their targets for a number of reasons. And so what we're really trying to do is encourage the kind of solutions, as Phyllis said, that will more immediately be able to help ramp up production, rather than, unfortunately, some of these discussions, which will take years, months, if not years, to resolve. And by the time international agreements are signed, we've hopefully moved on from the pandemic.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I think that in spirit, I certainly can understand, but to your point, what are the on the ground resources to really deploy immediately? Not to mention all of the negotiating and the important components that really could take quite a long time. So Phyllis, did you want to add to that?
Well, I think that it's important to note to reinforce that complexity issue, because this is why you've seen the partnerships happen the way they have. In essence, companies first quickly tried to iron out the process internally. They were making these, as you all know, as they were doing the clinical development, they were continuously improving the process, with the help of the regulators around the world. And then at the same time, they were starting to have the tech transfer conversations. And it's important to note that the tech transfer process for a biologic is a human capital intensive process. So it truly, that recipe, it's kind of a recipe and a chef's book, right? So the recipe is, the chef's book is, 5 minutes after you stir, it should look like this, and then you should do this. It's got that nuance to it that's really the know-how part. And so companies were, while ramping up manufacturing, deploying key parts of the manufacturing teams to actually do that know-how transfer to organizations, to other companies that could take that information quickly, because people were also doing their tech transfer in half the time of normal. So normally you take 18 months, do it, everybody runs a lot and then they run another one and you make sure you have the consistency and the quality you're looking for. Doing this on as quickly as we've done everything else with regard to the pandemic, while paying attention to safety. And so I think it's important to note how amazing 300 partnerships are. When you think about, we had the first real doses delivered in December of last year, and it's only June. And so I always want to remind people, we've been doing a lot in an incredibly short amount of time, and always with that eye on safety, always with that eye on safety and quality.
So one of the things, and I saw Ian put a question in the chat, so I'll get to that in a moment. But one of the challenges that we're facing in terms of getting doses out of the U.S., has to do with, I guess my understanding is government contracting and some of the challenges getting doses that are manufactured here out of the country. So Phyllis, could you break that down for us a little bit?
Absolutely. So this is one of the complexities of the way high-income countries were able to move more swiftly than COVAX to do contracts with manufacturers. And of course, it's important to note those high-income countries also funded the R&D and a lot of this manufacturing scale out, along with organizations like the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI. Hopefully you've heard of them. So a lot of the government contracts had in them the provision of deliver to me first, right? And that's where you hear people talk about how high-income countries locked up a lot of doses, actually more than their populations needed, with those early contracts. We are at a point now where many high-income countries are well into high vaccination levels and still have other contracts that will be fulfilled, but have doses that could be donated. The issue is making sure that all the legal bells and whistles of those contracts are managed, and that they make sure they work with each of the manufacturers around their contract to do what needs to be done to the contract to take doses that were bought for US use and donate them for international use. And that is the conversation that's happening right now. I think it's quite successfully that governments, industry, and COVAX are working on a really clear system for countries being able to donate doses they already acquired, or allow them to, doses they already acquired under current contracts, or doses they decide to buy later under future contracts. So many countries, including the US, have donated funds to COVAX, but also potentially could donate excess doses they acquired or buy new doses and donate them to COVAX. And the COVAX team has worked out a system for making sure these doses are donated safely, that they're covered by all the different programs, and that they're designated to specific countries, and that they reach as many people as possible. So some of the systems and governance are being worked out. But what we also want is for companies to actually be able to start exporting out of the United States. We've built an incredible amount of new capacity here for these vaccines. All the companies scaled up their own manufacturing and then partnered as well in the US. So we'd like to do what President Biden said in his speech to Congress. We want to become the arsenal of vaccines for the world and really maximize the great capacity we've already built here and start shipping doses from the US to COVAX and to countries that have contracts or need them. And that's one of the things that companies are working at with the government as we speak.
Thank you. Yeah, one of our colleagues, Joe DeMond, who's on our international team, I had asked him about this question, and one of the things we talked about was early on, the US government had to hedge its bets, right? And procure
Absolutely.
doses well before vaccine was even approved. They wanted to make sure to have the US covered. So they may have procured doses from J&J and maybe AZ and other companies whose vaccines may not even have come to fruition, at least in the United States. And because those have been procured by the US government, they can't be sold again in another in another country. So the donation is critically important, and getting through that, the bureaucracy of the US government is a challenge. But I think it's also,
and COVAX has its own bureaucracy. So
oh,
we
I'm
have
sure.
bureaucracies talking to each other. I think that's a really, really important note, Michelle, is that everyone's, covering, it's not like the donations are definitely more complicated because you're talking about medical products.
Mm-hmm.
Where was it deployed? So for example, the goal is to try to donate. So government procured doses that have not yet been taken possession by the US government are still sitting with the manufacturer are what they'd like to donate. That way you don't have all these extra, these products are frozen, they're cold, like as much as we can keep our hands off it and really have it go from originator to donating country. So that means it's a certain set of doses that are in play. Unfortunately, it's not the ones that are already deployed, which we like, but we can't do that for safety purposes.
Sure. So Ian, who's with the LEAD Coalition, do you mind just share a little bit about the LEAD Coalition and then ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, and this fascinating information. The LEAD Coalition is a dementia coalition, federal policy coalition, focused primarily on US federal policy, but we have a number of member organizations that work globally, particularly our industry partners, but not exclusively. So my question, born of both the breadth and depth of ignorance, is whether something like the Defense Production Act in the US could be a model for overcoming some of the production challenges overseas. I think I'm grasping that our domestic production is basically fine, if not perfect, and that the export challenges are a big piece of the global solution. But to the extent that the point was made that, say, production in India has been substantial, but that the distribution has been largely restricted to India for the time being, could you overcome some of that by asking either domestic US producers or manufacturers in other countries besides the US and India to ramp up production by drawing in non-pharmaceutical industry manufacturers of other items and supplies like syringe production, et cetera? Could you convert other industries' manufacturing capacity or leverage it to expand that production globally, for the distribution globally?
Some of the things that you mean go around the vaccine?
Yeah, or the vaccine itself. So I don't know all the technical capacities, but I accept your point. It's a very technical process. But are there parallel industries outside of pharmaceutical production where they have basically the right skill set? They just need a little training up and conversion of manufacturing facilities.
This is a great question. So in the very beginning of the pandemic, the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response Office was trying to, in seeking more capacity for production, as you just pointed out, to work with ag manufacturers, right? When we make vaccines we make actually billions of doses of vaccines for all the different, for all the different animals that we take care of, right? So dogs and cats and everyone, chickens and everyone get vaccines. So, and to some degree, the biologic process is similar, right? And that capacity is quite large. And so ASPR actually looked at whether or not we could leverage some of that capacity, both for drug making the vaccine, but also filling and finishing the vaccine. The problem is the regulatory structure is really, really different. And so the issue was no one believed we could actually, in time, take a product manufactured in an animal health site and have it hit the standards of a human health requirements from the FDA. So the regulatory part is an extraordinarily important safeguard, but it's a barrier to going fast when you're trying to do manufacturing. So most manufacturing facilities take 5 years to build de novo and 1 to 2 years to refit or retrofit, as we call it. And so unfortunately, that idea, which is a good one in the mid and long term, is not going to help us in the short term. But it is one of the ideas that we as industry are supporting and working with COVAX for the mid and long term, because we are going to have to make booster shots, for example. We have other things we're going to have to make in the out years, right? So no one in industry denies that we need to invest, both industry directly and governments and NGOs, in new manufacturing facilities. But we also have to right size, because we don't want to have 20 million doses of capacity in a market that's 11 million doses, and then you start closing down plants that you built 4 or 5 years ago. So the goal is to actually do these urgent things to maximize current capacity, and then indeed start looking at what plants could be upgraded and that we would have that can make certain things. Where will we put new plants? But also, where will we invest in plants for new suppliers? Because that's actually one of our biggest issues right now. We really increased manufacturing capacity worldwide, but we didn't necessarily increase the amount of suppliers making bags and vials and tubes and all the things you need for manufacturing. So part of what's slowing everybody down is actually the supply chain did not have the same level of investment and growth as the manufacturing side. And so a lot of the focus has been on focusing the less available supplies on COVID vaccine manufacturing. This is one of the other reasons we worry about the TRIPS waiver. You don't want to, I'll say this directly, you don't want to waste the very small, the narrow amount of supply constrained amount of supplies we need for manufacturing on a site that may not be as high in its quality as the sites we have today. Because then you might end up throwing things in the trash or having quality issues. You really need to put the constrained supplies in the manufacturing facilities we've got and get the 11 billion doses out the door. And then we need to look at investing worldwide in both sides of manufacturing so we can continue to do booster shots and respond to this pandemic.
So just apologies if I'm beating a dead horse. Again, I don't really understand a whole lot of the technical side of this, but I guess what I'm thinking is, can you get outside of your industry altogether? And so this may be a bad example, but I think it'll convey the point.
Right.
Could you go to like microchip manufacturing, which again is highly technical, specialized, sophisticated, highly trained workforce. The manufacturing plants themselves are pristine, et cetera. And could you quickly, to your point about pace at the front end, could you quickly ramp up if, say, China agreed that they were going to, for 3 months, convert a lot of microchip manufacturing to vaccine production? Would that work, or is that kind of a non-starter or more the long game than the short game?
I think you're right about the technicalness of the workforce, but the technical nature of the workforce is completely different. You need bioprocess engineers, you need biolab, you need quality control. So one of the discussions we're having is actually at the global level is the workforce problem we have in the biopharmaceutical industry. Other countries are outpacing us on biologics expertise at the graduate degree level, right? This is why we're also interested in STEM education, because we actually have a worry of a shortage in the US of biologics expertise. Right. We have a lot of people doing computer expertise. I think that you're right. It's a very highly educated workforce, but in the wrong discipline for what we need. Although it would be great. I think though that to your point, one of the things we could do is take companies that make, say, plastic bags for something else and turn them into people who make plastic bags for manufacturing and biologics. And that actually is something the US government is actually going to start doing this year. So I think there are ways to leverage that, right?
Right, with the PPE, when there wasn't enough PPE.
It worked with PPE, and I think that there's a realization that for plastic tubing and some of the things we need for manufacturing that are essential, but they're not as complicated, you could actually go to companies making like items and actually increase quickly the supplies for vaccine manufacturing, actually biologics manufacturing. So, cell and gene therapies as well as vaccines, et cetera. And that would probably be faster and would help with the manufacturing scale up. And I think you're going to see some hopefully some very good efforts by the U.S. government to do just that in the next couple of months.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Fumie, a question for you from Martha Nolan. Hi, Martha, who is with Healthy Women. Her question is, I think it's an important one. I don't know, Martha, if you want to go into it a little bit.
So the question has to do with what data we've learned so far. I mean, there's issues of supply and hesitancy, both here and abroad. And I was curious, since there's also been a lot of bad news, like AstraZeneca has gone through more levels of challenges in getting their vaccine out, let alone J&J, which got stopped, and that created this opportunity for an awful lot of misinformation to go out. But we did donate, I can't remember how many million, donate AstraZeneca to Mexico.
Like 80, we're sort of at 60 or 80, something, 60, 40. Yeah.
So the question then becomes, what do we know thus far, even from that, which was months ago, to the uptake and the challenges? Is there anything to learn from that? I mean, God knows we have enough challenges in our own wonderful U.S. with hesitancy and issues, even here in D.C., which has been reported in the news this morning, in terms of where the uptake is challenged. So what are we facing in that? And how can we be helpful to, so the question is, do we know anything yet? And how can we be helpful in addressing some of that in other countries where the news gets out there before you can deal with it?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question, and I think it's a little bit too soon to tell in terms of data, I think, and I'm not as familiar with the Mexico situation, but at least again, sort of more in the international COVAX level, I think we are seeing some countries who are, say, at the country level a bit question mark hesitating on certain types of vaccines, one product versus another. But at the same time, I think it also depends on the epidemiology of the country. So if you're in a crisis situation like India or Brazil, I think the risk benefit from a policy standpoint, but also individual preference, I think is a little bit different. Whereas I think you've seen it play out slightly differently in places like Europe, where if they have access to other doses, they did recommend that mRNA be given to the younger population, et cetera. So I think each country's approached it a little bit differently, and I think we're seeing, for a variety of reasons, hesitancy in different ways. But I think there is a lot of confusion out there, unfortunately. But I think, whether it's bio or IFPMA, we've been really trying to get the facts out through different campaigns. We have a campaign called Team Vaccines, where we talk about, as employees of the industry, why we work on vaccines and why we think it's important to be vaccinated. There are a number of different ways in which I think we've tried to break through some of the hesitancy and other factors, but at the same time, I think we do need to be cognizant of the very rare, but serious events that we are seeing. And so we're really trying to get misinformation out of the way and get the facts as much to decision makers at the policy level, but also to the extent possible to individuals as well. I don't know, Phyllis, if you want to talk about some of what bio is doing on that end.
Absolutely. Just very quickly, we've been working closely with many different partner organizations to make sure that trusted messengers have the information that they need to reach the populations they serve. And we've been doing this in the US, but working with, with the help of folks like Janet Mikulski and others, working with organizations like the Black Coalition Against COVID-19, that is an umbrella organization that has the National Urban League, the Pan-Hellenic Council, different Black church organizations, to really have front and center messengers talking about the vaccines in a way that's clear, that's culturally competent. We were working with organizations in the Latin American community, Native American community, etc., and also working with those great organizations that serve the elderly or seniors, and really making sure that they're hearing from people that they trust to share information with them. And then Michelle just put in the chat, we created the covidvaccinefacts.org website. And we've been really placing more and more videos there of people talking about the vaccine, and making sure they cover the side effects and the various questions people have.
And we've designed that site really so that you all can take videos from there and get them into your own channels, because we realize that Healthy Women will have a lot more subscribers, and different subscribers than we might to, folks who would go to necessarily a bio or IFPMA or industry website. So I think, and so those of you who know Dr. Lisa Fitzpatrick, who does the Dr. Lisa on the Street videos, she has, we're working with her, and she's put out a few very cool videos as well. So, Kelly Cox mentioned in the chat that is it, the AZ doses the US donated are still at the emergent facility waiting for FDA sign off to ship out. Is that still the case that we know of?
That's my understanding, yes. I think that given that AZ doesn't have its emergency use authorization yet.
In the US.
Yeah, right, or yes, exactly. Since it's the US doses, it would be the FDA that would guide them. If these were being donated by Europe, they could just go because authorization is completed in Europe. So it is a little complicated, the donation, given the, you need to donate something with some level of regulatory approval.
But this also, it's not just the EUA, because the J&J doses, there's millions waiting there, and it's for the FDA sign off of the actual emergent biosolutions facility, right? And so I think this is another point. This is another point of when we needed to ramp up in the first place, emergent was one of the only places that we could get online that the US government, that was of quality, according to the US government. So, and right now there's millions of both AZ and J&J doses locked up there because emergent mixed up and there was a fail, right?
Yeah,
and this is with the folks that know what they're doing. So I think it makes another point in terms of being able to get additional ramp up. The issue is often the workforce and know-how as opposed to something else.
So is there, knowing the audience we have here, right? You're all health care advocates, patient advocates. Is there anything the community can do? I know we're all waiting for these signatures from the FDA or, these bureaucratic complexities to be worked out in order to get doses out. I mean, are there any ideas that folks have, or is there any advocacy people can do to encourage that those processes be expedited?
So, Michelle, is part of the issue that FDA is just having bandwidth issues?
They're definitely working around the clock. When we talk to them, they are still working around the clock. I think that they're trying to make sure that whatever the issue was that caused the snafu at Emergent doesn't happen again. And so I'm sure there's a lot of invested time in ensuring the quality and that the processes are being held to the highest order. And that's probably taking them a little bit of time. It would be interesting to know how soon they expect to sign off on those doses so they can get out the door. It would be a good question.
We have candles lit at all of our houses, just waiting.
Kelly would know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, hope is good.
At least you have a partnership with Merck. That's really good.
I mean, is there a
Well-
specific ask from the advocacy community to Janet or someone else at FDA, or are they really doing everything they can and we just need to leave them alone and let them do their thing?
Kelly, do you have a feel for whether this would be helpful?
I don't know.
Why don't we find out what I think that we certainly, it's funny because I was just talking to Marion Gruber, who runs the Office of Vaccines, last week, and didn't push on this. So why don't we see what we can find out? And indeed, I think that calling for the expeditious movement of doses, to help with the global crisis is a good thing for all of us to do. And certainly lauding the government for starting to make donations of all of the different vaccines is a good thing to do. And I think that there's a lot more doses committed than and having a clear strategy from the U.S. government on how what they're going to donate and how they're going to do it would be great. But I think we should all reinforce the importance of doing the donations.
Absolutely. And again, when this kind of comes back to the president's speech or some of the things that the USTR has talked about, is that we are trying to solve a problem in very practical ways, right? Getting doses out of the country, ensuring that we can, overcome some of these, I don't want to say bureaucratic because it's not just bureaucracy. I mean, we want to ensure safety, but ensure that can happen quickly. And I think that's a place that people are putting their energy, and the TRIPS waiver kind of almost takes away from that. That looks at a long-term process that would take a year or more to negotiate through, even before you start the on-the-ground build up, scale up, and sharing the recipe. And I think one of the things that from the industry perspective, just so folks know that we're concerned about, is giving that recipe also requires giving up your intellectual property. And once you've surrendered that IP, those rights in one country, the recipe is out there. And I think that from a manufacturer's standpoint, that also means that all of the work that went into that is now kind of free for all, which definitely it should be over time at the appropriate time. But if going in to the next pandemic that you may have to surrender your IP rights in 18 months, it's harder to justify doing everything that has been done over the last 18 months to really come together and create solutions to this global challenge. The economies of scale really kind of work against the process at that point. So, and I know that gets really technical, but I think it's important to note. Ian, were you going to say something?
Well, it just, I'm struggling a little on what the asks are of which government offices for the short term and the long term. So I'm just riffing a little to give a couple of examples, but if IP is priority one, figuring out the IP stuff, maybe this is or isn't something that DeGette and Upton work on through cures. If the issue is that the State Department isn't leaning and USAID aren't leaning on some other agency enough, well, that's a different ask of a different set of actors. If the challenge is that we need to mobilize other members of Congress around support for low and middle income countries, well, then maybe that's Chris Smith and Maxine Waters, who have worked together really well on a lot of LMIC issues. But that's obviously, if it's legislation, that's a longer game than if it's getting a key member of Congress to lean on the State Department. So I just don't know exactly. There are probably 50 things that would be good to do, but what are the top 3 and who are the actors?
I think that's part of the conversation today, is to kind of just lay the challenges on the table. And I think about, as follow-up, what could be done. We may not have answers right now. So
No,
Phyllis
actually,
may.
I think that it would be great if the government relations team were here, but I think that on the Hill, we've been talking about the following things. Literally, strongly discouraging the Biden administration from going through with what they declared about the intellectual property waiver. It literally does not solve the mission that they say they're trying to solve. So if the goal is to get more doses to more people worldwide in the next 3 to 8 months, the TRIPS waiver does not help with that, because it has to be negotiated. It literally, it has to be negotiated, and more importantly, it wants you to do new partnerships that you would then dedicate time to. So if we do it quickly, it will actually take away from scaling up as we have promised to scale it down. So what can really help us right now? What can really help us right now? Donating doses, exporting doses, and getting all the free flow of materials right this minute. There are countries with export bans. There are countries, literally something as simple as when, identifying the SKUs of the most important supplies for manufacturing. So every country that has manufacturers of those, when they see that SKU hit the export desk, they stamp it for export without sitting on it for 2 weeks. Like, these are every 2 weeks we wait, every month we wait, delays manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
So there are things that the World Trade Organization can do with everyone sitting next to the table on export control right now that would speed supplies. There are things that everyone would do right now that would help maximize manufacturing. And there are doses that are available right now that could be donated to countries. That's the right now moment. And then very shortly after that, are there a few more partnerships that can be done to bring more doses close to places? Can we invest in suppliers so that they can add new lines, add more manufacturing capacity, and then some suppliers maybe flip from making this thing to that thing, as we talked about, that's a great idea. And then let's have a conversation about right-sizing manufacturing worldwide for hopefully not the second half, for the rest of COVID post-pandemic. I'm gonna call it post-pandemic COVID, but also pandemic preparedness. These are 3 tranches that have very different actions in them and very different times. They're all vital. But our energy today, and this is what we're trying to say to Congress, our energy today should be on what facilitates manufacturing, delivery of doses, and country readiness. So we heard today, there are doses sitting inside COVAX or at countries that are not yet deployed. There's still paperwork that speed of getting countries ready is the cold chain ready. This is one of the things you mentioned, USAID, that we've discussed with USAID in particular. How can we make sure that the US government is helping countries be ready for these vaccines when they show up on the tarmac, right? So cold chain, nurses and doctors ready to give it. We learned a lot in the US. I mean, we're a developed country with an infrastructure for public health, and we still had trouble getting vaccines in the arms in the first place. How can we help countries be more ready? So we're calling on USAID to help with that, HHS as well. We're calling on US trade representatives to focus on these export issues at WTO. We're calling on Congress to make sure that they're protecting intellectual property both for this pandemic and the next pandemic.
Yeah, and I think the tangible takeaway is another tangible takeaway is you can now see all of the work that is happening right now, all of the important work that that Phyllis is talking about, that Fumie has talked about, and if the TRIPS waiver were truly to be implemented, and the president has endorsed it essentially, it would sort of start from the ground up. And right now we're actually moving in a direction and are pretty far down that direction that we believe will achieve success in shorter order, and in more kind of practical ways. But those are really, really important points.
And I think we would certainly want to make sure we share with all of you, as we start to see more success internationally, that you see it too, right? So I think that I think it was Martha, who's from Healthy Women, made a really good point that we do seem to hear more bad news than good news. And so I think it's important for us to make sure people are hearing the good news. doses are getting to countries. People are starting to see vaccinations in countries, low, middle, high income countries. So how can we also make sure that we are sharing with you that when doses are arriving and getting used and vaccination programs are happening? Because I think we all care about seeing successful vaccination happen all over the world. I think we all care about that.
So I know we only have a couple minutes left. I don't know if there are other questions folks have. I've just put into the chat a letter that Dr. Michelle, our Bio CEO, sent to the president earlier this month. And so Phyllis, do you want to talk just for a couple minutes about Cher, which is a sort of a, not Cher the singer, although I do love Cher the singer, SHARE, which is included in the link here.
And I'm not going to remember the acronym, so my apologies. But in the letter that Dr. Michelle sent to the president, we actually had started talking about many of the things we talk about in the roadmap with our sister associations. And that's how can the US government today be doing things to facilitate doses going to low and middle income countries in particular. And it captures some of the things we talked about in the roadmap. The roadmap is more about all governments. And really to the US government, we said, work with us to figure out the schedule of deliveries of doses you're going to take from the US and plan for donations of doses. Work with us to manage how the Defense Production Act is affecting the availability of vital manufacturing supplies for the rest of the world, right? So that there can be more manufacturing ex-US in the partnerships already underway. Work with us to figure out how to start to ease the contract requirements on the manufacturers so they can start exporting from the US to other countries. So it's really very similar to the roadmap itself, but calling directly on the US government to work with industry in the United States to lead in the international arena on the issue of doses for everyone. And I think we wanted to applaud the president's words in his speech, support those as industry, but also make sure he understood that the TRIPS waiver was not going to deliver on the mission that he had outlined.
Great. So Fumie, you mentioned a campaign that IFPMA has and really aimed at the sort of the folks who are making this supply chain. Do you mind sharing the name of that? I was just going to DM you, but I figured I'd put it up in the chat because we do have
Team Vaccines. Let me pull up the address and send that in the chat.
Yeah. And the videos are really, really good. There's all these great videos of the scientists working within the companies around the world, talking about why they do the work they do, what it means to them to make these important vaccines to help end the pandemic. And a lot of powerful stories from those who are on the front lines of making vaccines, just reaffirming their commitment to the work. And there's a lot of other great material in the Team Vaccine site.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. So a couple takeaways from the chat, and we'll make sure this is in the follow-up as well. COVIDvaccinefacts.org, that's the bio COVID vaccine website. Please go there. You're welcome to link to any of the videos or share them through your channels. I believe they are posted through YouTube. And those really aim at vaccine hesitancy. So again, any of you, we'd love it if you would leverage those in your communities. Again, some videos and information really aimed at the folks, the science and the scientists. Teamvaccines.ifpma.org. And we will certainly get back to you when there are, to answer Ian's question, what exactly are the asks? I think there's definitely opportunity there. And we always know that the patient advocacy community is really a global community. And that our goal really is to help folks around the world. So
Michelle, let me put a link to the COVAX site in the chat as well.
Just in terms of the good news, the numbers are not as high as we would like it to be because of the various challenges we discussed. But I think it really is important to note that it's quite stunning that within months weeks of first deployment in the more developed countries like the US, UK, and Europe. We have over 100 countries around the world, and 71 million doses shipped. We wish it was higher, but it is happening even despite the challenges, and we're hoping that with increased donations from US and other countries with excess doses, that we can even raise those numbers and really try. I mean, the COVAX is trying to get to the most vulnerable populations in every country, and so and that's why it's so important. The 5 steps, the removal of the trade barriers and dose sharing is the most effective and efficient way to get those numbers higher in the short term.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure this will be a major topic at the World Health Assembly, which kicked off yesterday, I believe. Although I know you're in Geneva, but it's still a virtual meeting, as I understand it, which makes sense. It's the World Health Assembly. But certainly wish you well as you ably represent us there. And thank you, Fumie and Phyllis, for all the work you do. Phyllis, for those of you who don't already know her, is she's 17 employees in one, because she's leading so many projects and doing so very, very successfully. She is a role model, absolutely. And and everybody, of course, who works internationally. I got this text from Kelly Cox. It's like, wow, Fumie's here. That's great. So of course, to work with you again and see you is fantastic. So thank you, everyone. Have an awesome day. We will get information out to you today as a follow-up, and we'd love it if you would share it. So